The bronze doors of the Palazzo Vecchio creaked open on a morning when Florence trembled beneath an uncertain sky. Inside, a man sat hunched over his desk, while scratching against parchment with the desperate urgency of someone racing against time itself. Niccolò Machiavelli had learned something that most men discover too late: destruction, when properly understood and deliberately wielded, becomes the most powerful tool of construction the world has ever known. His fingers, stained with ink and marked by years of political maneuvering, moved across the page with precision. He was not merely writing about power, he was dissecting it, laying bare its sinews and bones like a surgeon examining a corpse. But, this particular morning, as news of yet another political exile reached his ears, Machiavelli found himself contemplating something deeper than the mechanics of rule. He was considering the profound alchemy of self-transformation that occurs when a man voluntarily destroys his weaker self before the world can do it for him. The concept had been brewing in his mind for months, perhaps years. He had watched princes rise and fall, had seen the mighty reduced to ash by their own weaknesses, had witnessed the seemingly weak emerge as titans through their willingness to shed everything that made them vulnerable. There was a pattern here, a code that governed the process of becoming truly unbreakable. Outside his window, the merchants of Florence conducted their daily business, unaware that they were living demonstrations of his theory. Those who clung too tightly to outdated methods found themselves crushed by more adaptive competitors. Those who recognized when their old ways had become liabilities, who possessed the courage to burn down their familiar structures and rebuild from superior foundations, discovered a kind of immortality in their enterprises. Machiavelli dipped his quill again, considering the paradox that had captured his imagination. The path to becoming unbreakable required first becoming utterly broken. Not by external forces, which left one bitter and reactive, but by one's own deliberate hand, which granted control over the process of reconstruction. This was not the destruction of despair, but the destruction of strategy, the calculated demolition that cleared ground for a stronger foundation. He thought of Caesar, who had crossed the Rubicon not in a moment of reckless abandon, but after systematically destroying his old identity as a general bound by the Senate's will. The man who had emerged from that river was fundamentally different from the one who had approached its banks. Caesar had killed his former self as surely as if he had driven a blade through his own heart, and, in doing so, had become someone whom the old rules could no longer touch. The technique was visible throughout history for those who knew how to look. Alexander had destroyed his identity as merely Philip's son before he could become the conqueror of worlds. Augustus had murdered the idealistic young man he had been in order to birth the calculating emperor who would rule for decades. Each had understood something that eluded most men: the self is not a fixed entity to be protected, but raw material to be sculpted. Machiavelli rose from his desk and moved to the window, watching the flow of life in the street below. A young merchant was arguing with a customer, his face flushed with indignation at what he perceived as an insult to his honor. The older man next to him, clearly his father, watched the exchange with tired eyes. Here was the eternal drama playing out in miniature. The young man's attachment to his pride would either destroy his business or force him to evolve. His father had already learned the lesson, had already destroyed the part of himself that needed every customer's approval. This was the first principle of the rebuilding code: identification of the weak self. Most men lived their entire lives without ever truly seeing themselves clearly. They moved through the world carrying 1,000 small vanities, fears, and attachments that made them predictable and, therefore, vulnerable. They feared loss of reputation more than loss of opportunity. They valued others' opinions more than their own progress. They clung to comfortable lies rather than face uncomfortable truths. The weak self was not simply the collection of one's flaws, it was the entire architecture of thoughts, beliefs, and reactions that made one susceptible to external manipulation. It was the part of a man that could be flattered, threatened, or deceived. It was the identity that required constant validation from others to maintain its stability. Most dangerously, it was the self that believed its current form was its final form. Machiavelli had seen this weakness exploited countless times in the corridors of power. A duke undone by his need for his courtiers' admiration. A general defeated because he could not bear to retreat, even when retreat meant eventual victory. A merchant bankrupted by his inability to adapt his methods to changing markets. Each had been destroyed not by superior force, but by their own unwillingness to destroy the parts of themselves that had become liabilities.
The process of identification required brutal honesty, the kind that most men spent their lives avoiding.
It meant examining every belief, every habit, every emotional reaction to determine whether it served strength or fed weakness.
It meant asking not, "What do I want to be true?" but, "What is actually true?"
It meant recognizing that the very qualities that had brought success in one context might become fatal flaws in another. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. His assistant entered with news from Rome, another shift in the political landscape, another opportunity for those wise enough to read the signs. Machiavelli nodded, but his mind remained focused on his developing theory. These external events were exactly what he meant. The world was in constant flux, and those who remained rigid in their thinking would be swept away by forces they refused to acknowledge. The weak self was characterized by its resistance to change. It created elaborate justifications for maintaining the status quo. It told comfortable stories about why things should remain as they were. It confused familiarity with wisdom and mistake with learning. Most insidiously, it convinced its host that adaptation was betrayal, that growth meant abandoning one's true nature.
But what if one's true nature was not a fixed thing to be preserved, but a dynamic process to be guided? What if the highest form of self-respect was the willingness to transcend one's current limitations?
This was where most men failed. They treated their personalities like sacred relics rather than like tools to be sharpened. Machiavelli returned to his desk and began writing again, his thoughts flowing now with greater clarity. The first step of his rebuilding code was becoming complete, the meticulous cataloging of every aspect of oneself that could be exploited by others. This was not an exercise in self-hatred, but in strategic assessment. A general who refused to acknowledge his army's weaknesses would lead them to slaughter.
A man who refused to acknowledge his psychological vulnerabilities would be manipulated by anyone clever enough to identify them.
The weak self manifested in predictable patterns.
It reacted instead of responding. It defended instead of adapting. It sought comfort instead of growth.
It prioritized being right over being effective. It confused intensity with importance and busyness with productivity. It made the same mistakes repeatedly while expecting different results.
Perhaps most importantly, the weak self was ruled by fear masquerading as principle.
It dressed up cowardice as loyalty, laziness as contentment, and ignorance as innocence. It created elaborate moral frameworks to justify its limitations and called its refusal to change integrity. It would rather fail honestly than succeed through adaptation. As the afternoon light began to fade, Machiavelli found himself considering the merchants in the street below once more. Those who would survive the coming changes were not necessarily the strongest or the most established, but those most willing to see clearly what was no longer serving them. They would be the ones who could examine their methods, their assumptions, their very identities with the cold eye of a craftsman evaluating his tools. The weak self hated this kind of examination. It preferred the comfortable darkness of self-deception to the harsh light of honest assessment. It would create 1,000 excuses to avoid the mirror of truth. But, for those brave enough to look, the rewards were beyond imagination. For once a man truly saw what made him vulnerable, he could begin the work of making himself invulnerable. This was not about becoming someone else, it was about becoming more truly oneself by shedding everything that was not essential. Like a sculptor removing excess marble to reveal the statue within, the process of destroying the weak self was actually a process of discovery. What remained after the destruction was not less than what came before, but immeasurably more. The quill scratched on, documenting the first movements in a dance that had been performed by every great figure in history. They had all learned to see themselves clearly, to identify what needed to be destroyed, and to undertake that destruction with their own hands before the world could do it for them. This was the beginning of wisdom, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. As night fell over Florence, Machiavelli continued his work, knowing that he was not merely writing about power, but discovering the deepest secrets of human transformation. The weak self had been identified, its patterns exposed, its vulnerabilities catalogued. Now came the more difficult work, the actual process of deliberate destruction and calculated reconstruction. But that was a task for another day, and another part of his emerging code. For now, it was enough to have begun, to have taken the first step toward understanding how a man might make himself truly unbreakable.
The foundation had been laid. The architecture of destruction was taking shape. Part 2, The Forge of Deliberate Destruction. 3 months later, Machiavelli found himself in the gardens behind his estate, observing a process that had become his daily meditation. A gardener was pruning the olive trees with methodical precision, cutting away branches that had grown strong and healthy throughout the season. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed like destruction for its own sake. But Machiavelli understood the deeper wisdom at work. Next year's harvest would be abundant precisely because of this apparent cruelty. The parallel was not lost on him. The second phase of his rebuilding code required the same kind of deliberate, strategic destruction. Having identified the weak self in all its manifestations, the next step was to systematically dismantle it with the same precision the gardener showed with his olive trees. This was not the destruction of passion or desperation, but the destruction of craftsmanship. He had spent weeks studying the process, both in his own life and in the lives of those around him. The pattern was consistent. Those who achieved true invulnerability had all passed through a period of voluntary destruction that others would have found unbearable. They had deliberately placed themselves in situations that shattered their comfortable illusions and forced them to develop new capacities. The process began with what he had come to think of as strategic discomfort. Most men arranged their lives to avoid anything that might challenge their existing beliefs about themselves. They surrounded themselves with people who confirmed their biases, engaged only in activities they had already mastered, and carefully avoided any situation that might reveal their limitations. This was the behavior of the weak self, the constant seeking of validation and the careful avoidance of growth. Deliberate destruction required the opposite approach. It meant actively seeking out situations that would expose one's weaknesses. It meant engaging with people who disagreed with one's fundamental assumptions. It meant attempting tasks that were likely to result in failure. Most importantly, it meant being willing to look foolish in service of becoming wise. Machiavelli had tested this principle in his own life, deliberately placing himself in political situations where his usual methods would not work. The experience had been humbling, sometimes humiliating, but ultimately transformative. Each failure had revealed another aspect of his weak self, another assumption that needed to be questioned, another method that needed to be discarded. The key was to approach this destruction with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. The ego wanted to make it personal, to feel attacked or diminished by the process. But the wise man understood that he was not his current limitations, he was the awareness that could observe and transcend those limitations. This distinction was crucial. Without it, deliberate destruction became merely self-punishment, a form of psychological masochism that served no constructive purpose. True deliberate destruction was guided by a clear vision of what one wished to become. It was not random demolition, but selective removal of everything that stood between the current self and the ideal self. Like a master builder tearing down parts of a structure that were sound but inadequately designed for the loads they would eventually bear, this process required both courage and wisdom. The gardener finished his work and moved on to the next tree. Machiavelli approached the pruned olive tree and examined the cuts. Each one was clean, precise, made at exactly the right angle to promote healing and new growth. There was no hesitation in the cuts, no half measures that would leave ragged wounds vulnerable to disease. This was the model for the destruction of the weak self, complete, clean, and purposeful. In the realm of human psychology, this translated to a systematic dismantling of limiting beliefs, toxic habits, and counterproductive emotional patterns. It meant identifying the stories one told oneself about why change was impossible, and then deliberately proving those stories wrong. It meant recognizing the comfortable lies that kept one trapped in familiar patterns, and then choosing the uncomfortable truth that would set one free. Machiavelli had observed that most people approached change backward. They tried to add new qualities to their existing personality rather than removing the qualities that made growth impossible. They tried to become more confident while still believing they were fundamentally inadequate. They tried to become more decisive while still being attached to having everyone's approval. They tried to become more successful while still being afraid of failure. This approach was doomed from the start. It was like trying to build a palace on a foundation of sand. The weak self would always sabotage any attempt at improvement that threatened its existence.
The only solution was to destroy the weak self completely, to tear down the faulty foundation and build anew on solid ground.
The process required what he called voluntary vulnerability.
This meant deliberately exposing oneself to the kind of experiences that the weak self feared most. If one was afraid of criticism, it meant seeking out honest feedback from those qualified to give it.
If one was afraid of failure, it meant attempting projects that were genuinely challenging.
If one was afraid of rejection, it meant making requests that carried real risk of being refused.
Each act of voluntary vulnerability served a dual purpose.
It exposed the specific fears and limitations that needed to be addressed, and it began the process of proving to oneself that survival was possible even when those fears became reality. The weak self's power came largely from the unknown, from the terrible things that might happen if one stepped outside familiar patterns. But, once those terrible things were faced directly and survived, they lost their power to control. A young courier arrived with messages from various contacts throughout Italy. As Machiavelli read through the correspondence, he saw the principles of deliberate destruction playing out in the larger political arena. The city-states that were thriving were those that had abandoned outdated strategies and rebuilt their approaches to match current realities. Those that clung to past glories and familiar methods found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The same dynamic operated at the individual level. The merchants who prospered were those willing to abandon profitable but declining markets to enter uncertain but growing ones. The artists who achieved lasting recognition were those who destroyed their signature styles when they became too comfortable and predictable. The soldiers who survived were those who abandoned tactics that had worked in previous wars but were unsuited to current conflicts. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of deliberate destruction for most people, to accept the need to abandon what was working in favor of what might work better. The weak self wanted to hold on to every advantage, every familiar comfort, every proven method. It confused accumulation with growth and stability with stagnation. It failed to understand that in a changing world, the greatest risk was not in changing, but in refusing to change. Machiavelli set down the correspondence and walked deeper into the garden, his mind working through the mechanics of this transformation.
The process had to be systematic, not random.
It required a clear understanding of which aspects of the current self needed to be preserved and which needed to be destroyed. It was not about becoming a different person, but about becoming the best possible version of oneself. The destruction had to be complete in specific areas rather than partial across all areas.
Half measures in this work were worse than no measures at all.
A man who partially destroyed his tendency toward people-pleasing would become confused and inconsistent, pleasing some people some of the time without any clear principle to guide his choices. But a man who completely destroyed that tendency would develop new, more effective ways of building relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate accommodation. This completeness required what he thought of as burning the bridges.
The weak self was remarkably good at rebuilding itself if given any opportunity to do so.
It would use the smallest remaining attachment to its old ways as a foundation for complete reconstruction. The only solution was to make return impossible, to destroy not only the limiting belief or behavior, but also the conditions that had supported it. For a man trying to overcome his addiction to others' approval, this might mean deliberately taking positions that he knew would be unpopular with his usual social circle. For a merchant trying to overcome his fear of risk, it might mean investing all his capital in a single venture that he had thoroughly researched but could not guarantee. For a ruler trying to overcome his sentimentality about traditional allies, it might mean making decisions based purely on current strategic value rather than past loyalty. The pain of this process was real and should not be minimized. Destroying aspects of oneself, even weak and limiting aspects, created a genuine sense of loss. The familiar, even when it was dysfunctional, provided a kind of comfort. The predictable, even when it was destructive, offered a sense of control. To voluntarily give up these false comforts required a kind of faith that something better would emerge from the destruction. This faith was justified by results, but it had to be maintained during periods when results were not yet visible. The gap between destroying the old and establishing the new was often filled with uncertainty, discomfort, and confusion. This was the valley that had to be crossed, the wilderness that had to be traversed between the familiar slavery of the weak self and the hard-won freedom of the strong self. As twilight approached, Machiavelli made his way back toward the house, his understanding of the destruction phase now complete. The weak self had been identified in the first phase, catalogued and understood in all its manifestations. In this second phase, it had been systematically dismantled through deliberate acts of strategic discomfort and voluntary vulnerability. The old foundations had been cleared away, the limiting beliefs uprooted, the counterproductive patterns broken. But destruction alone was not enough. Without proper reconstruction, the space left by the destroyed weak self would simply be filled by new weaknesses, possibly worse than the original ones. The third phase of his rebuilding code would address this challenge, the art of conscious reconstruction, the deliberate building of a self that could not be broken by others because it had already been tested and refined in the forge of its own making. The work was far from over, but the foundation for invulnerability was now clear. Through deliberate destruction, guided by wisdom and supported by courage, a man could tear down everything that made him vulnerable and prepare the ground for something immeasurably stronger. The olive tree would flourish next season because of this year's pruning. The man who destroyed his weak self would flourish for the rest of his life because of the courage he showed in wielding the blade of transformation against his own limitations. Part 3, The Architecture of Invulnerability. The first frost of winter had touched the olive trees when Machiavelli finally understood the nature of true reconstruction. Standing in his study before dawn, he watched ice crystals form patterns on the windows, delicate, complex structures that emerged spontaneously from the marriage of order and chaos. This was the image that had been eluding him for months as he worked to complete his rebuilding code. The new self was not built like a fortress, rigid and defensive, but grown like a crystal, following natural laws but adapting to circumstances. The previous phases of his work had been concerned with destruction, first identifying what needed to be destroyed, then actually destroying it. But reconstruction was a fundamentally different process. Where destruction was about removal, reconstruction was about cultivation. Where destruction was about analysis, reconstruction was about synthesis. Where destruction was about endings, reconstruction was about beginnings that would have no end. He had spent weeks observing the process in himself and others, trying to understand what differentiated successful reconstruction from the mere accumulation of new habits and beliefs. The difference, he had come to realize, lay in the fundamental architecture of the new self. The weak self had been built around protection, protecting one's ego, one's comfort, one's familiar identity. The strong self was built around expansion, expanding one's capabilities, one's understanding, one's sphere of influence. This distinction was crucial because it determined every subsequent choice and reaction. The protective self asked, "How can I avoid loss?" The expansive self asked, "How can I create gain?" The protective self sought to minimize risk. The expansive self sought to maximize opportunity. The protective self was ruled by fear of what might go wrong. The expansive self was guided by excitement about what might go right. The reconstruction process began with what he called conscious design, the deliberate choice of principles that would govern the new self. This was not about adopting someone else's principles or following conventional wisdom about what one should become. It was about examining one's deepest values and highest aspirations, then designing a self that could embody those values and achieve those aspirations in the real world. Most men never engaged in this kind of conscious design. They simply accumulated experiences, opinions, and reactions without any overarching structure to organize them. They became collections of random elements rather than integrated wholes. They developed habits that contradicted their values and pursued goals that undermined their principles. They were like cities that had grown without planning, functional in some areas, chaotic in others, with no coherent logic connecting the parts. The consciously designed self was different. Every element was chosen for a purpose and arranged according to a plan. Every belief was examined for its utility in achieving desired outcomes. Every habit was evaluated for its contribution to overall effectiveness. Every emotional pattern was assessed for its role in maintaining stability and promoting growth. This did not mean becoming mechanical or losing one's humanity. Rather, it meant becoming fully human in the most conscious and deliberate way possible. It meant taking responsibility for one's psychological architecture instead of leaving it to chance, circumstance, and unconscious inheritance from others. The foundation of this new architecture was what Machiavelli called principled flexibility. This was the ability to maintain core values while adapting tactics to meet changing circumstances. The weak self confused principles with methods, treating specific approaches as if they were eternal truths. The strong self understood that principles were about direction, while methods were about navigation. One remained constant while the other adapted to terrain. A man built on principled flexibility could not be manipulated through false dilemmas or forced into choosing between effectiveness and integrity. He understood that true integrity lay not in rigid adherence to specific behaviors, but in consistent alignment with core values through whatever behaviors best served those values in current circumstances. He could be diplomatic without being deceptive, aggressive without being cruel, generous without being naive. This flexibility extended to identity itself. The weak self was attached to being seen as a particular type of person and would sacrifice effectiveness to maintain that image. The strong self was attached to achieving particular types of results and would sacrifice image to maintain effectiveness. The weak self said, "I am the kind of person who always." The strong self said, "I am the kind of person who achieves." And, then, did whatever achievement required. A messenger arrived as the sun was rising, bringing news of developments in Rome that would require careful consideration and, possibly swift action. Machiavelli received the message with the calm attention that had become his hallmark since beginning his rebuilding process. The old version of himself would have either reacted with anxiety about the implications or excitement about the opportunities. The new version simply gathered information and began analyzing options. This was another crucial element of the reconstructed self, the development of what he called emotional sovereignty. The weak self was ruled by its emotions, buffeted by every shift in mood, driven by every impulse, controlled by every fear or desire. The strong self was the ruler of its emotions, able to feel them fully, understand their messages, and choose how to respond to them. Emotional sovereignty was not about suppressing emotions or pretending they didn't exist. It was about understanding their purpose and managing their expression. Emotions were information about one's relationship to circumstances. Fear signaled potential danger, anger signaled violated boundaries, joy signaled alignment with values, sadness signaled important loss. The wise man listened to this information without being controlled by it. This required developing what felt like a different relationship to one's own mind. Instead of being identified with every thought and feeling that arose, the reconstructed self maintained a position of awareness that could observe thoughts and feelings without being consumed by them. This awareness could evaluate whether a particular emotional response was appropriate to current circumstances or was an echo of past conditioning. It could choose to amplify useful emotions and dampen destructive ones. The process of developing emotional sovereignty was ongoing and required constant practice. It meant repeatedly choosing response over reaction, awareness over automation, consciousness over conditioning. It meant being willing to feel temporary discomfort in service of long-term emotional health. It meant developing the capacity to remain centered even when external circumstances were chaotic. As the day progressed and Machiavelli dealt with various matters of business and correspondence, he found himself noting another essential component of reconstruction: the cultivation of multiple competencies. The weak self often specialized in a single area and, then, defined itself entirely through that specialization. It became the merchant or the scholar or the courtier and felt lost or threatened when circumstances required different capacities. The strong self understood that in an uncertain world, survival and success required versatility. It developed competencies across multiple domains, not to become a dilettante, but to become truly capable of handling whatever challenges arose. It understood that specialization was a tool to be employed when appropriate, not an identity to be defended when inappropriate. This meant becoming comfortable with being a beginner repeatedly throughout life. The weak self hated the vulnerability of not knowing, the awkwardness of learning, the temporary incompetence that preceded mastery. The strong self embraced these experiences as the price of growth and the gateway to expanded capability. It understood that the discomfort of learning was temporary, but the limitation of not learning was permanent. The cultivation of multiple competencies also served a deeper purpose. It prevented the reconstructed self from becoming brittle through over-optimization in a single direction. Like a portfolio of investments, a portfolio of skills provided stability through diversification. If one area of competence became obsolete or ineffective, others could compensate while new areas were developed. By afternoon, as Machiavelli worked in his garden performing the physical labor that helped clarify his thinking, he contemplated the final element of reconstruction, the establishment of what he called autonomous validation. This was perhaps the most crucial aspect of becoming truly unbreakable, because it addressed the fundamental human need for approval and recognition in a way that made one independent of others' opinions. The weak self required constant validation from others to maintain its sense of worth and identity. It measured its success by external metrics: others' praise, others' envy, others' acknowledgement of its importance. This made it infinitely manipulable by anyone who could control access to those external validations. It would compromise its principles, abandon its goals, and betray its values in pursuit of others' approval. The strong self developed internal systems of validation that were more reliable and more accurate than external ones. It measured success by its own standards of excellence, progress by its own chosen metrics, worth by its own values and principles. This did not mean becoming indifferent to others' opinions, but rather becoming selective about whose opinions mattered and why. Autonomous validation required developing what felt like an internal board of directors, the voices of wisdom, excellence, and integrity that could provide feedback and guidance without the contamination of personal agenda or external pressure. These might include historical figures one admired, principles one held sacred, or future versions of oneself that one aspired to become. The key was that these sources of validation were chosen consciously and aligned with one's deepest values. This internal validation system had to be robust enough to sustain one through periods when external feedback was absent or negative. It had to provide clear criteria for evaluating choices and measuring progress. It had to be specific enough to guide action but flexible enough to accommodate growth and change. Most importantly, it had to be truly one's own, not inherited from parents, absorbed from culture, or adopted from others without conscious examination. As evening approached and Machiavelli returned to his study to continue his writing, he reflected on the complete architecture of invulnerability that had emerged through months of observation and experimentation. The process was now clear: identify and destroy the weak self, then consciously reconstruct a strong self based on principled flexibility, emotional sovereignty, multiple competencies, and autonomous validation. But the true power of the system lay not in any single element, but in their integration. Principled flexibility provided the framework for making decisions that were both effective and ethical. Emotional sovereignty provided the stability to implement those decisions without being derailed by internal turbulence. Multiple competencies provided the tools to execute decisions across various domains. Autonomous validation provided the motivation to continue the process even when external support was lacking. Together, these elements created something that was genuinely unbreakable in the most important sense: a self that could not be destroyed by others because it was no longer dependent on others for its essential structure. External circumstances might change, external opponents might attack, external supporters might withdraw, but the core integrity of the self would remain intact because it was self-generating and self-sustaining. This was not the brutal invulnerability of the sociopath who felt nothing, but the elegant invulnerability of the master who felt everything but was controlled by nothing. It was not the rigid invulnerability of the fanatic who could not change, but the fluid invulnerability of the wise man who could change anything except his essential commitment to truth and excellence. The man who had undergone this complete process of destruction and reconstruction had indeed destroyed his weak self so thoroughly that others could never use it against him. He had become like water, soft enough to yield to any container, strong enough to wear down any obstacle, capable of taking any form required by circumstances while maintaining its essential nature unchanged. As Machiavelli completed his final notes on the rebuilding code, he understood that he had documented something more than a theory or a technique. He had mapped a process of transformation that was as natural and reliable as the changing of seasons, as powerful and enduring as the forces that shaped mountains. The process was available to anyone with the courage to begin it and the persistence to complete it. The weak self would always emerge first. It was the default human condition, shaped by fear and limitation, dependent on others for validation and direction. But it need not remain. Through conscious effort and deliberate design, it could be transformed into something genuinely unbreakable, a self that was simultaneously completely flexible and completely stable, completely open and completely protected, completely humble and completely confident. This was Machiavelli's final gift to those who would understand the knowledge that invulnerability was not about building walls, but about becoming water. The knowledge that true strength was not about hardness, but about adaptability. The knowledge that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already become something that destruction cannot touch, not because it is too hard, but because it is too fluid, too conscious, too aligned with the fundamental forces of growth and change that govern all life. The rebuilding code was complete. The path to invulnerability had been mapped. The choice to walk that path remained with each individual who encountered these ideas. For those with the courage to begin, the wisdom to persist, and the patience to complete the work, the rewards were beyond calculation: a self that could not be broken, a life that could not be destroyed, and a legacy that could not be erased. The bronze doors of the Palazzo Vecchio would open again tomorrow on new challenges and new opportunities. But the man who opened them would be different from the one who had closed them, not because circumstances had changed him, but because he had changed himself. He had learned the secret that separated the truly great from the merely ambitious: the willingness to destroy oneself in order to become oneself. This was the ultimate paradox and the ultimate truth of human transformation. To become unbreakable, one must first be willing to break completely. To become invulnerable, one must first embrace total vulnerability. To become immortal in the only way that matters, one must first be willing to die to everything that was not essential. Machiavelli set down his quill and smiled. The work was finished. The code was complete. The path was clear. What remained was for others to discover these truths for themselves, to test them in the crucible of their own experience, and to emerge transformed by the ancient alchemy of conscious destruction and deliberate reconstruction. In the end, this was the only victory that truly mattered, not the defeat of external enemies, but the transformation of oneself into someone who needed no external victories to be complete. Not the accumulation of power over others, but the development of power over oneself. Not the building of walls to keep the world out, but the cultivation of strength that could let the world in without being overwhelmed by it. The man who accomplished this transformation had indeed become unbreakable forever, not because nothing could touch him, but because everything could touch him and he could touch everything in return, flowing like water through whatever channels life provided, always moving toward his chosen destination, always maintaining his essential nature, always growing stronger through the very forces that would destroy a weaker man. This was Machiavelli's rebuilding code, the ancient art of becoming unbreakable through the mastery of breaking and rebuilding oneself. The path was open. The choice was clear. The time was now.